Hello, my fellow witches, sorcerers, and other magical practitioners. My name is Aiden, and welcome back to Sky Snake Sorcery, Episode 6 Who Are Your Folk? More specifically, though, how do we engage with folk magic in the modern world, and how do we understand what this term is and apply it in a more relevant way, I guess? If you couldn't tell, I have issues with the term folk magic in the modern parlance, particularly just who are your folk? When we talk about folk magic, we're talking about people magic. Folk refers to the people, and I feel like the word has been really decentralized away from that. And I think that as we go forward as a magical community, we need to really reevaluate and reassess what folk magic means and what that really is. So, I guess we should probably start off with what do I mean by folk magic? I'm going to do a lot of defining of terms, and I'm going to probably throw a bunch more terms. Feel free to message me about it later if you are confused about literally anything. I do tend to talk really fast, and I understand that I also throw out a bunch of words that people may or may not understand. This is something I'm trying to work on. But I want to start out with folklore, referring to folkloric magic, referring to magic built out of folklore, and things that aren't necessarily people oriented, but stories that we grow up with, stories we hear, read in fairy tales, things like that. There are a lot of people who take practices out of folklore and turn it into magical traditions, spell work, and things like that. Folkloric magic is sometimes called folk magic. I just wanted to address it here really quickly. It's not the focus of this episode, and I will not really dive too deep into it, but I have heard people use folk magic to refer to folkloric magic, usually in reference to traditional witchcraft, the modern practice that is called traditional witchcraft, that is. As for folk practice, it refers to customs, traditions of the people or of a place. Folk practice is a lot more ambiguous and is usually what we're talking about when we say folk magic. Now, a folk practice can evolve out of pretty much anywhere in the world. It can evolve out of any sort of local custom. We find folk practices on both a large scale, where we see things, for example, like celebrations of Our Lady of Guadalupe, where we see celebrations of Kalisara, where we see celebrations of these more enigmatic figures and grandiose saints who represent a group of people as a total. But then we find more niche folk practices for smaller groups of people. As we talk about these types of spirits, we're also going to encounter the folk spirits, spirits that are not necessarily formally codified but understood by a group of people, usually passed on through oral lore. Now, there's also a lot of spirits like this who are very popular. Of course, Jesus Malaverde, Santísima Muerte, San La Muerte, all very, very popular in Central South America. We also have plenty of folk saints throughout the world. Saint Guinevere is, of course, very popular, being the dog saint. Folk spirits refer to spirits that the people venerate but are not codified by mainstream religion. Most often, we hear about this in the Western context as folk saints, which has become a very, very popular term that sometimes gets misapplied, which is what we're going to talk about a little bit later. And finally, who the folk? The people. Folk refers to the people and is who we're talking about. Who are your folk? Is the ultimate question of this episode. Who are your people? When we talk about folk magic, we are talking about people magic. We are talking about popular magic, meaning populace, the people's magic. And that usually ends up being rooted in all kinds of different nuances and intersectionalities. So, before we get into all of that, let me do a little bit of self-promotion housekeeping. My books are open for divination right now. However, Spellwork is going to be closing in the middle of September. The second week of September, I am closing all Spellwork bookings. If you have not booked with me, I will not be taking on any new clients until the end of September because I'm doing quite a bit of work and traveling and all kinds of stuff this month. So I will not be able to take on new Spellwork clients, but I can take on divination clients. Also, be sure to check out my store. I finally posted my oils. I have a Golden Honey Love Oil, which is a love oil for attraction and drawing, but also to help bring out your own personal desires. I have a Speedy Success oil, which is my favorite oil out of all of them. It smells super good. It feels super nice. It is an oil to confer success upon yourself, your spirits, and your workings. And finally, the Silver Wheel Money Oil, which is a lunar money oil to help bring in and keep money in your life. So feel free to check me out at aidenthevivitch.com. That is AIDENTHEVVITCH.com, as well as at aidenthevivitch on Instagram. And feel free to reach out to me via email at aidenthevivitch1@gmail.com. With all that out of the way, though, let's talk about the use of folk magic in modern witchcraft spaces. Often, this is used as a modern distinction between high and low magic, which are already very fraught terms. They are terms that evolved kind of out of the magical revival of the 1800s and the 1900s. You see this especially with things like the Golden Dawn and the OTO. High magic is defined as the magic that orients itself towards the esoteric world, focused on the soul, divinity, salvation, piercing the veil and going deep into the mysteries. You see this a lot really with the ceremonial magicians as it relates to things like scrying the Enochian aethers, the Tattva squares, and all other manners of meditative, esoteric, contemplative practices and rituals designed to gain certain ingress into the mind of God, which is all well and good. Then there's what gets called low magic, which is your everyday needs. Money, stability, love, success, favor, fortune, the ability to eat at night, the ability to sleep at night, the ability to go outside at night. It is your basic needs. High and low magic are naturally very problematic terms. Again, there's a sort of moral superiority and level of importance kind of implied in the names, with high being like, oh, this is the true, real magic that's super important because I get to sit all day inside and think about God. Whereas you low magicians have to get money to eat and live. There's a classism kind of implied in this, which we'll get into that in a second. Lots of high magical grimoires are full of low magic operations. You see things like, various spirits are able to bestow upon you wealth. The Greater Key of Solomon, which is arguably probably the premier high magic grimoire, which I love the Key of Solomon. I use it all the time. It is so full of do this pentacle to get a girl, do this pentacle to get money, do this pentacle to get a job. It's full of all kinds of things like this. Because quite honestly, high and low magic are really not that separate and distinct. Plenty of ceremonial operations aim to improve material needs, as it's kind of necessary to be able to have stability in the material world if you're going to live in the material world. Ceremonial magic often gets classed as high magic, and more folk expressions of magic tend to get classed as low magic. And this is usually due to the stereotype that folk magic is entirely oriented around, money, love, protection, things like that, which is not always true. There are plenty of examples of folk traditions that are very much oriented around the divine. We have saint feast days for a reason. We have all these different types of prayers. We have all these different ways in which we engage with the divine. The fact that there are, in fact, folk saints, there are mysteries there to explore. And this just brings us to the classism is completely inherently part of high and low magic. It has been a whole historical thing for quite a long time and really exploded in the 19th and 20th century, especially with the advent of lodge magic, with again like the Golden Dawn, the OTO, and other paramasonic organizations. There's just an inherent classism to all of it, and that's not to say that you can't do ceremonial magic if you don't have money, or you can't do folk magic if you do have money, because again, that's classism, just reversed. It's not saying that any of this is inherently tied to social class. However, there's an expectation of, based on your economic standing, you'll be doing one thing or another. This is still a thing that perpetuates to this day. I have encountered people several times who talk about folk magic being just getting money, which is not true, just quite frankly not true. It is a stereotyping that has been going on for quite some time. Part of it does have to do with the fact that ceremonial magic tends to have very expensive and elaborate tools. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't make alternatives of these tools. In fact, all throughout Western Europe and also into Eastern Europe and the New World, we see these tools being remade in different ways. We see new exorcisms, new prayers, and ways of being able to create them that don't require you to go out and find a cat and rip it open and then boil it and pour its blood onto the knife while mixing it with henbane. There's much more normal and well-adjusted ways of doing it now. We also see different tools such as the sword, which is very elaborate in the Greater Key of Solomon, being turned into more easy to obtain items. Things like the golden crown, things like the lion skin belt, all of these things get turned into simplified versions or alternatives that produce the exact same results without having to go out and find a lion and skin it and then paint all these names of God on it. There is nothing new about high magic and low magic being diametrically opposed and fraught with classism. What is interesting to me right now, though, is this being turned now into folk magic and ceremonial magic, which are just kind of a reskin of the same terms. Folk magic, again, refers to the people. Ceremonial magic refers to ceremonial ways of doing things. These are not inherently mutually exclusive. It's a false dichotomy. Like these ideas of these things being separate and the idea that ceremonial magicians have always been noble seekers of the one divine monad and getting the deepest gnosis possible, that's never been the case. Because we see all these different things, for example, in the PGM, of yes, there are wonderful, beautiful operations to gain contact with these higher beings, similar to modern rites like the Abramelin or the Bornless ritual designed to gain access to your holy guardian angel. The 8th Book of Moses is a phenomenal example of this and is a ritual that I adore in structure, in theming, and in use. However, there's so many love spells in the PGM, you cannot tell me that ceremonial magic is all about pursuing the divine, because plenty of PGM spells are very ceremonial in nature, where they involve, you dig the pits, you sacrifice the animals, you burn the incense, you say the names, you call the spirits, and you're like, can I get a girl to like me, please? It's never been true that ceremonial magic has always been about finding the gods and engaging with the highest intelligences. And the same with folk magic, it's not always been, can I get the girl? Can I get money? Can I kill my enemies? Can I be protected from my enemies who want to kill me? That is a part of it, and it's a part of both types and styles of magic. However, folk magic specifically, and this is sort of my opinion, but I do think that when we're using this term, we should be a bit more cautious about what we're saying, how we're saying it, and why we're saying it. To me, folk magic refers to the way that the people of a given place do certain things that adapt to the needs of the people. And the needs can be spiritual and esoteric needs. Again, saint days, in fact, saints themselves provide these needs. We see all kinds of things where saints are syncretized. This is how we get folk understandings of saints. Obviously, Mary's a phenomenal example of this, where she is syncretized with so many different spirits across the world. She is a portal back to ancestors and ancestral spirits. But that isn't, that isn't get me love, get me money. This is a necessary access point for us to engage with our spirits in a way that allows us to covertly engage with them without losing these traditions. We are able to graft them onto these spirits, and these spirits serve as a meeting point, a crossroads, to gain access back to the world that we lost. And indeed, a lot of folk magical traditions, especially witchcraft-specific traditions, are deeply entwined with the other world, are deeply entwined with the esoteric and learning the mysteries of the universe. But the mysteries of the universe also don't get you paid. This is a thing with ceremonial magic too, you learn the mysteries of the universe so you can put the Jupiter Pentacle in your wallet so you can make money. It's all the same thing. We're all trying to get paid, we're all trying to get laid, and we're all trying to get even. If you know, you know. Why do we call it folk versus ceremonial in the first place? It's just a general misunderstanding of terms, like I've been saying. Most folk rites can be very ceremonial in nature, but they might not appear the same way as Western ceremonialism has appeared since the 20th century. There's plenty of folk ceremonial rites. I don't really know why we don't talk about this as much, but I mean, Procession of saint statues is a ceremonial rite, the washing of various icons and calling upon these spirits. Sure, there's not a magic circle, but that's ceremonial. You're doing ceremonial magic. When you go down to the river and you say certain songs and prayers calling forward the spirits of the river, and then you dive in or you dunk people in and you call them out and up and you send away the malefica on them and you feed the river spirits with fruits and all kinds of other sacrifices. That's ceremonial magic. It just might not look like I'm standing in a circle with a bunch of tools and calling out names of God. That is a ceremonial ritual. And specifically, again, folk refers to the people. We have to ask, who are the people? The imagery of what we academically called folk magic seeps its way into popular consciousness and therefore becomes popular magic, and in turn gets called folk magic. We have this notion of what folk magic is supposed to look like. It's a candle on a plate surrounded by herbs. It's going out into the woods and stabbing a tree with some nails and saying stuff. It's going out at night in flight and calling up your familiars. We all have these ideas of what folk magic is, but who are the folk behind it? Because each of these things is an encoded technique. Each of these things is a way of understanding the world, and each of these links back to an earlier understanding of reality, and oftentimes an animistic one. Animism is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but I personally don't see as many people truly incorporating it into their lives. I'm probably going to do a whole episode about this because y'all know I love to bitch. Y'all know I love to talk about shit. And animism is one of those terms that I think gets thrown around a lot, like folk magic, traditional witchcraft in general. And I think that a lot of people aren't super sure how to integrate that properly. So we look to the aesthetics of folk magic. What that gets defined as academically is kind of vague. Again, it's people magic. It's whatever the people were doing. Folk magic can be anything from an incantation bowl to flying out as a werewolf in the armies of St. Christopher. These are folk magic, but they do not look the same and do not operate the same, and one's witchcraft and one is not magic that is magic, but magic's a complex term. What one culture calls magic, another culture calls religion, which segues nicely into folk religion. Folk religion often gets applied to a particular adaptation of a mainstream religion, particularly Catholicism and Christianity. In Western contexts, I've seen the term folk Catholic a ton, and I see it get applied to things that I just did growing up as a regular Catholic, so it's kind of a little weird to me sometimes. Like novena candles being called folk Catholicism. I'm like, that's just Catholicism. I don't know. The folk aspect of Catholicism is very important because so many different traditions around the world that were colonized by Catholicism do adapt it to their own needs. Saint Bridget is a phenomenal example of this as the sort of pan-Celtic deity Bridget. In all of her incarnations, we find her becoming Saint Bridget and becoming very important, of course, in Ireland, but also in France. We see her popping up in England, in Scotland, and she becomes a very central figure because she is a way to go back to that ancestral understanding, that way of doing things. But now she is a saint, she has been Christianized, so she takes on new mysteries that blend with the old mysteries. That is kind of what folk Catholicism probably means. However, when you're doing that, you're not calling it folk Catholicism. Like, if you're raised like me in Catholicism and you happen to not be super white, you tend to pick up things that are a bit different. I was raised with a notion of fairy faith. The fairy faith I practice now is different from the fairy faith concepts that I grew up with. They are inherently different. I grew up knowing that the good neighbors came to Earth as angels and stayed here and became the neighbors. They did not go with Lucifer, however, they are not obedient to God. This is kind of the understanding that I grew up with, and it kind of made sense at the time. But I was never thinking like, oh, I'm a folk Catholic doing fairy faith. I'm just Catholic and fairies exist. Other notions, like the way that we engage with saints, is very, very different than a lot of, I guess, mainstream white homogenized Catholics. I grew up going to Latino and Filipino primarily churches. as well as I went to many places with a high Black population. We kind of all did our stuff together. What I grew up doing was different than what other people ended up doing, but it was all Catholicism. We never really were like, oh, that's folk Catholicism over there in that church. So this term is just so weird to me to hear sometimes. And it's just part of it is that's a me thing. Part of it is I kind of get weirded out by the term because it is very academic and retroactively applied onto a group of practices. It's kind of how I feel about Gnosticism, because that wasn't a religion that existed. That's a retroactive term we applied to a bunch of different people who were doing a whole bunch of different things around the world, even. Again, adoption of folk religion has become very popular in witchcraft spaces. There are many genuine practices that do evolve out of this. There's many people who genuinely approach Catholicism in this more specifically folk lens. I think there's an important difference between adoption of ritual and lived practice, and that's kind of the biggest thing. Adoption of ritual is something that I see quite a bit in the occult community, and I think it's sort of the threshold point that kind of distinguishes you from someone who is interested in these things and someone who lives these things. There is a threshold point of adoption of ritual, where people adopt a philosophy, people adopt a religion and way of doing things, but don't fully integrate it into their life. Again, this is a thing with animism, where a lot of people are theoretical animists, but who is talking to their door? Who is talking to their crossroads? Who is talking to the trees outside their home and know their names and know the stones that made the home's names and their house spirit and all these different things, right? House spirit is actually very popular, but I digress. This is just something that I also grew up. I wouldn't say I grew up I wouldn't say that I grew up animist in the sense that I didn't call myself an animist, I just had an animist understanding of the world. I do call myself an animist now, mostly just because I call myself a pagan as well. I don't really use those terms as self-identifiers, but they are helpful terms to describe what I do in a way that's easy enough to convey. But animism and many other practices, again, the folk Catholicism thing, end up tending to be an adoption of ritual, which there's nothing wrong with that. I tend to be very mean and harsh, I feel, when I talk, but there is nothing wrong with being someone who adopts ritual. It is just learning how to integrate that and how to process that and move forward and develop further in that practice. I don't think there's anything wrong with being at a step on a journey. You are welcome to be at any step on any journey, because that's kind of the point of your life, is to figure out what step is next and how to grow. I do want to make this episode about finding your folk magic, finding who your people are, and being able to go beyond what is just an adoption of ritual, these are folk magic techniques, which is a term I have, again, a rough feeling about. I feel like the term folk style, folksy, or folk magical way of working, things like this, are kind of problematic, as in they don't really touch on who the folk are again. Like, when you're working in a folk magical way or doing a folk style working, what is that invoking? Like, what are you talking about? Whose folk are you trying to work in the style of? There are a lots of different traditions of what gets called folk magic. Again, basically any group of people in the world can create a folk magic, which we'll get back to that a little bit later. However, I feel like when we talk about working in a folk magical way, and when we talk about engaging in magic through folk magic, we tend to forget who the folk are we talking about. We end up homogenizing it, and this is going to be a little shady. We tend to, in America, homogenize folk magic down to Southern USA hoodoo, or conjure, or whatever. This is largely because hoodoo and conjure are kind of the enigmatic, all-American practice in some way, but also are not. It's a very complex discussion around where hoodoo begins and where other traditions start. Because things like Appalachian folk magic, what gets called Appalachian folk magic, I should say, granny magic, all these different traditions, they have overlap and similarities because people talk to each other. This is like a thing that a lot of people don't understand is that people talk to each other. It's like kind of how human history functions. And that's where things get a little bit interesting, because these styles, aesthetic styles, I should say specifically, of doing things do look a lot like hoodoo, but they also look a lot like a bunch of other things, because a lot of other people were doing similar stuff, and people were like, oh, I do this too, but here's what I do specifically. And also, a lot of things just weren't called stuff. Like, I grew up around hoodoo. I don't practice hoodoo. Never get that wrong about me. But I grew up around hoodoo, and I've seen hoodoo throughout my life. And I just lived in Savannah. Hoodoo is everywhere. But when I was growing up, we didn't call it hoodoo. We didn't call it conjure. We didn't call it really anything other than the stuff my neighbors do. That thing you do with the candle. Special prayers. Things like that. Other stuff like, I knew how to work this Saint Michael the Archangel stabbing the devil statue, but I never did because that was scary to me. But again, I never called that brujeria. I never called that folk Mexican witchcraft, which is also another label that I use all the time that I also don't believe in, but whatever. Don't worry about it. It conveys an idea of what I am. I knew how to work that statue. I knew that was a thing that people were doing. I was honestly floored when, in Mexican sorcery, Laura de Villa was talking about that statue, because I was like, oh my god, I remember this. And all kinds of other little traditions, like Good Friday through Easter Sunday being a day that the devil reigns, and all this other stuff, right? Again, these were things that I grew up knowing, that I kind of figured out some of them, and then heard about them and all this other stuff. The devil was very present and very real when I was a kid, in a way that was different than rapture fear and the devil's gonna get you fear that some other people have. My childhood experience is very unique and interesting. I'm just such a cool person. But again, like, these notions that get called folk, these notions that get called folk magic, folk practices, folk Catholicism, were just what I grew up with. So that's my people. That's who I understand. That's how I talk and understand the world, right? But a lot of other people see these things, see the aesthetic of, you know, the saint statues, the saint shrines, the way that we do things in, again, Southern USA Catholicism, specifically Mexican Catholicism, is a very specific brand and genre that is very popular, especially for people who are reconnecting, who are Mexican American Chicanos, especially, white Latinos like me. If you didn't grow up with all that, it's something that you latch onto as an aesthetic. I can speak very heavily from a Chicano experience. As much as I'm like talking like, oh, I knew how to do these various things, I didn't know how to do everything. Like, I'm not a bruja. I'm not, I don't consider myself to be anything other than what I am, which is titles I have by initiation, a witch, and myself. But I don't consider myself to be anything grandiose, right? What I do consider myself to be is someone who experienced some interesting stuff as a kid, who learned stuff, and then later learned, oh, that's called this magical thing, that's really cool. Which we'll touch on this a bit more, but that is a little bit of what folk magic kinda is old wives' tales, stories you just kinda hear about and get passed on, which we'll talk about that a bit more in depth later. But the aesthetic of folk magic is very much alive in the minds of the modern witchcraft and greater magical community. And it's something that a lot of people gravitate towards. It's something that's very familiar, especially, again, in America. We kind of know what this stuff looks like, but we don't necessarily have the exact words for it. So we latch onto folk magic, folk Christian, folk Catholic, all these other things. Hoodoo, conjure, which those are real legitimate terms, they also have their own connotations. Similarly to, again, brujeria, Mexican folk magic, all these different things, brujeria is a very specific thing, right? That's a very specific type of Mexican witchcraft. And again, there's other types of brujeria in other types of Latin American countries, but what I understand as brujeria is going to obviously come from a Mexican perspective. It is specific, it is very culturally specific and culturally ingrained, which again is kind of the whole thesis of this, is the folk are a culture, and who that culture is determines the type of magic, the way that it's done. And even if it looks very similar, it is that understanding that is necessary. It is that extra bit of This is why we do it. This is the how, yes, but this is the why. This is the why and the who, and the reasoning behind all of that tends to come down to a lot of historical nuances, geographical nuances, and other little details that make up the tapestry of a culture. Because cultures are meant to be living. Cultures are not snapshots in time. We can't travel back to ancient Greece as much as I would love to and say, I am a priestess of Artemis. I am a priestess of Hecate. The priesthood does not exist in the same way. We have priesthoods modernly in revival and reconstructionist groups, but we do not have them in the same way. And again, the priesthoods were relatively states oriented to some extent. There was quite a bit of state overlap. This happens with a lot of different types of priesthood in overcultural religions, where yes, they are of service to the people, but they are also of service to the state, and also are of service to the ruling body of the religion, which usually also has to do with the state or has at least some political power, especially in older times. So we have to also be willing to decolonize and deconstruct our ideas of religion, especially ancient religion. This is a big thing, especially when we look at syncretic saints. These saints, yes, are access points back into the old world, and it is a little bit uncomfortable to engage with saints if you've been traumatized by Christianity, which, let's be honest, so many of us have. Because there is that connection back to overcultural Christianity, back to the church, back to the authoritarian and patriarchal society that inherently upholds. But these saints also are not just the same as ancient Artemis, ancient Diana. We can't assume that we can just go back to that through these saints. It is understanding why these spirits evolved into these saints and how these saints still aid their people. That's very essential to getting to the root of folk magic. So, let's get to the root of folk magic. Let's find the folk in folk magic. What the folk have we been talking about? I'm so sorry. I'm going to keep making that joke. It is not funny. I don't want to just bitch all day about the community and how I don't like it and how my opinion matters the most because I have one. But I really want to encourage thoughtful discussion, self-analysis, and expansion into more areas of study. I want us to really be productive. I want us to think, okay, so this is a problematic term. Yes, our ideas around it are fraught with all kinds of different lacking of nuance, desiring to latch onto aesthetic and idea, but we can do something with this. We are at a threshold. We are at a point of being able to go deeper into something that we never thought was possible. I am always going to encourage growth and never shame people for being at a step on a journey. Because literally, what's the point in that? I will never pretend like I was a perfect saint my entire life and like knew everything and like I totally I totally never had a phase where I was like, yes, the ancient god and goddess. Like, you know, like I have been in various stages of my life. And I will never claim to be someone who has all the answers, because if I had all the answers, I would have so much money and not live on Earth. But what I want to be able to do is be a touch point, be able to help people figure out, how do I dive deeper? How do I really connect with the root of what I'm searching for? And be able to grow and develop into a community of both spirits and people, and be able to identify not just with a label that people will understand, but also be able to integrate into a larger framework, a larger way of understanding an entire spiritual ecosystem that is folk magic. And that really starts out with identifying what folk you want to be part of in your folk magic. Like, what practices do you feel drawn to the most? What do you see in the world that's like, this is really what I want to be doing. This is something that I really resonate with, that I really connect with, that I understand and want to understand deeper. What do you see that feels just right for you? Identify where that draw to that knowledge comes from. Like, why specifically? You know, you can take some time and really write out what you want from that practice. Like, what am I trying to figure out? What is missing from my life that this practice specifically opens up? And also, don't be afraid to research a ton of practices. You know, like, there's a lot out there. There's a lot of people doing a lot of shit, and it's fucking crazy sometimes. Like, people are out here doing all kinds of things. And one thing that I have learned as I've grown deeper into the community and deeper into spirituality, occultism, whatever you want to call it, I have learned that so many things that I thought were made up and don't exist do exist in a legitimate capacity. And you can find ways to engage with them. You can find ways to really develop into a real, legitimate, and fulfilling practice out of all kinds of things. Things that I never thought were possible are possible. And being able to do that legitimately without taking away the inherent power which comes from the people, which comes from the fact that you are part of community or wanting to be part of community, or taking away the essential mechanics and spiritual understanding and just taking the baseline practice. Being able to integrate fully is something that changes your life in really profound ways. I'm always going to be grateful for every bit of knowledge I have ever had, and for the many dreams telling me to do a thing, and then I do the thing, and then I'm like, oh wow, this completely changed my life. Wow, thank you. What practices draw you in? And don't be afraid to integrate all kinds of things. Don't throw something out just because it doesn't match the aesthetic. If you grew up with an idea and a concept that you just stick with, a really easy example of this is knocking on wood. I fucking swear by knocking on wood. I don't play about that shit. It's real legitimate to me. It works and it does the thing. And if you have stuff that you grew up with that works and does the thing, don't throw it out just because you're trying to adopt another practice. Learn where that line ends and connects with the other one. See how they come together. I have found a lot of confluence in the traditions that I participate in. I have found that while the reasonings are different, these spirits respond very similarly to different things. And I've kind of started finding the middle line cosmology between a lot of the traditions I practice, where one thing explains something that another doesn't really have an explanation for. And I'm like, okay, this makes sense now. This clicks. And the spirits are like, yes, this is kind of a thing. But we have different understandings of it because, you can't really fit perfectly in Greek tradition and Mexica reconstruction. They don't perfectly fit together. But we do have similar ideas, and where those ideas are similar, we're able to make connections and start to build overlaps and build bridges between them. We want to build community. We want to build tradition. We want to recognize that we want to have this tradition continue. And for it to continue, we have to be able to grow and expand it and bring life to it. We have to bring that fire. We have to bring that building up of sources, of new ideas, of fresh perspectives that still honor the tradition. This is a big thing for me, is recognizing how to honor tradition while expanding on it and developing it further. Another important part of what practices draw you is recognizing why you seek them out in the first place, which we kind of touched on a little bit, but more specifically, why this tradition? Let's go, for example, why do you want to do Southern USA hoodoo versus Midwestern hoodoo versus Pennsylvania Dutch magic versus granny magic versus New England witchcraft? All these different things that exist in the same country. Why are we seeking out specifically Southern USA hoodoo? And you might have your answer for that. It's, my ancestors are from there. Even though I live in Canada now, I want to honor my ancestors who were enslaved and brought here. Okay, well, let's figure out where specifically now. Let's say Georgia. I'm just really familiar with Georgia because I just lived there. Let's say Georgia. Okay, I want to understand how they did things in Georgia. You might find out my ancestors were Muslim. Specifically in Savannah, we actually had plantations that had several people who were enslaved that were Muslim. It's very important that we talk about the different religions of hoodoo and the fact that hoodoo is not a religion itself, but rather is an understanding and ability to survive in the world through the use of magical techniques. And again, understanding that what we determine to be magic in the modern world tends to be, a bunch of hocus pocus, to be quite honest. But there was an understanding that I find flows through a lot of folk traditions, that you do the magic and you take the medicine. You say your litany of prayers over your Tylenol. But a lot of older traditions and ways of doing things were tied into what we now separate out as science. And I'm going to get into that in a whole other episode, I'm sure of it. Understanding these histories are very important for connecting back to our folk. Okay, my people were Muslim and they were brought to Savannah forcibly, and I find out all these different things about this specific group of people that I want to integrate with. Okay, well, I'm not Muslim. I am a neo-pagan, but I am able to understand why my people did these things and understand certain specific techniques. I don't speak Arabic. I don't write Arabic. Okay, maybe I should learn a couple things. Maybe I should pick up the Quran and read it. Maybe I should start integrating Quranic verses into my practice, slowly building out these little things. It's important to identify that, especially, let's say you don't personally have any connections back into these cultures. This is important to really figure out the why, which we're gonna get into that here in a second. I've kind of already touched on this, but who are the people in your practices? You need to know the folk to do the folk practice. It is people practice, right? I always try to specify where I'm talking about a tradition. So again, Southern USA hoodoo is very different than Midwest hoodoo versus New York hoodoo, New York City hoodoo even. They're all very different. I grew up in Texas and I moved to Georgia. I'm very familiar with those different types of hoodoo, which are also very different than Florida hoodoo, which has a bit more of an influence from Santeria and Ocha and other forms of Lukumi, things like that. That's all very much influenced Florida hoodoo. Whereas Georgia hoodoo is influenced by several different things. And again, even individual places have specific influences. While Orisha tradition is very big in Savannah today, there are several people in Savannah who are very Orisha oriented. We also have the Ayatunji village, not too far from us. It did historically have several plantations of people who are Muslim. There's also plenty of Christians, and a lot of people converted to Christianity here, forcibly converted for the most part, in Savannah. And, that gets brought in through the various churches and the way that churches do things, and the things that get called taboo, the things that get called good and evil, various understandings of conjure. In Savannah, it was a very big thing. We have famous conjure doctors. We have very well-known people who were changing people's lives, both in Georgia and in South Carolina on that Gullah coast. The Gullah Geechee people are still very much around today. I've met several people who either are Gullah Geechee or who are very closely tied back into the culture in one way or another. That is very specific, versus Texas hoodoo, which is very Catholic, very Mexican, and very indigenous. It is a very different flavoring overall, way more Catholic than every other place, other than probably Florida, but specifically Roman Catholic versus Santeria. And all these different things influence and change the flavor of the folk magic. You go into Western European folk magic, it's like, okay, I want to learn about French magic. I want to learn about French fairy faiths. Well, Northern France, Southern France. Italy's a big thing for this too, I have a friend from Sardinia who's very different practice than my friend who is Italian American but Sicilian, right? They have all very different practices and understandings. Different deities even are very important, and some of them are able to retain their deific identity, while others are reincarnated basically into saints. It's all very different, and we can't, again, single out the one folk practice of an entire folk. When you want to enter a folk practice, you are asking to be part of a culture. You're saying, I want to sit at the table. I want to be here. I want to show up. I want to do the thing. I want to be part of the thing. Can I be part of the thing? You are not demanding to be part of a culture. You're not seeking ownership of a culture. This is something that I think a lot of us struggle with, especially Americans have this ownership quality, and plenty of other people do too. But we specifically have this ownership quality tied into consumerism. We want to be able to own the book that says we do the thing. We want to have the title that says we do the thing. We want to have all this stuff that shows we are performing the thing. We're very big on performing the art. There's like 15 things in that could be 500 podcasts. Not episodes, podcasts themselves. But we are performing the thing, oftentimes in America. which we have to kind of put aside and say, okay, I want to integrate. I want to be part of this community. I want to sit at the table. How do I learn to sit at the table? How do I learn to greet people? How do I learn to clean up the table, set the table, and prepare food for the table? I mean this in both a very metaphorical sense and a very literal sense. Misa espiritual, we have to set up the table. We have to set up the mesa blanca, right? We have to set up the table. We have to set up the food. We have to prepare everything for us to do the work, to have misa. You have to prepare the offerings. You have to have the offerings in the first place. You have to do all this stuff to sit at the table of spirit. When you're asking to be part of a culture, you're doing the exact same thing. You're asking, I want to be able to go to these events. I want to be able to learn the way of doing things. I'm going to show this by learning the language. Learning the language is a very big thing. I am learning so many languages. It is super awesome. That's also why my accent's always all over the place, among other things. I will learn the language. I will learn the customs. I will bring gifts. Gifts are great. I love making gifts. I love receiving gifts. I love giving gifts. Gifts are amazing. But more importantly, it shows that you're willing to put in the effort to not only just show up, but show up with something. And if you can't show up with something, that's also fine, but make yourself useful. Be someone who's like, can I get this done? Can I do this? Can I do that? Can I help you with anything? No? Okay. What is the best use of my energy and time? Okay, I will do that. And a big thing is just being open and understanding that the mentor with the long beard, with the wizened eye and the twinkles of stars in his eyes aren't going to show up and say, yes, you are the chosen one to receive the hoodoo initiation. That's not gonna fucking happen. What's gonna happen is you're gonna be cleaning things up and you're going to overhear a story about a thing and you're gonna be like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, wait, I have heard of a thing like this. Oh, you have? Yes, this is my understanding of it. Oh, here's a more specific understanding of it. Oh, okay, now I know a thing. I don't know. I think that there's a lot of aestheticization, and it's not purely an American thing. I'm just really hard on Americans. I say this as someone who's British. Let that sink in. But there is a big aestheticization. I mean, we see this, of course, with traditional witchcraft, wanting to be Western European or Eastern European so bad without having really any connection to the actual culture that comes behind that. But we are still asking to sit there. We are asking to say, okay, I want to learn fairy faith in an authentic Scottish way. I want to learn about it in southern Scotland. I want to be able to understand the mounds. I want to understand the going in and going out. Okay, well, I'm going to learn the language. I'm going to understand the people. I'm going to understand the food. Food's very important in a lot of cultures. And you kind of find out very quickly that these super awesome magical things are also super normal mundane things. Not that there's a separation between mundane and magical, but that's another podcast entirely. But the ability to understand cultural jokes, cultural norms, little insider things that you just don't get if you're not encultured, improve your ability to do magic. You understand why these things are being used. You understand, oh, the wooden spoon's being used in this way because of this thing and this story and the way that we cook food. That's all part of it. And it's important, especially, again, if you are trying to get access to something that you do not culturally have the understanding of, and you might not have the ethnicity of that tradition. This gets very dicey very fast, and as a light-skinned Chicano, I don't have a super ton of space to talk about this, just because I'm a light-skinned Chicano. But just because you are of an ethnicity or are not of an ethnicity does not give you the right or access to anything, ever, in general. Just because you are 5% Scottish does not mean you have access to Scottish stuff. And also, just because you aren't Scottish does not mean you don't have access to Scottish stuff. I have been seeing really crazy things that are definitely white supremacist in nature of trying to close Scottish magic as someone who is Scottish and has been to Scotland and spent a good amount of time in that as a kid living right near Scotland. Hello? What? And of course, this gets a lot more difficult when we talk about non-white cultures and traditions, and there's an inherent power imbalance and all of that. Just because I'm a Chicano, just because I'm half Mexican, just because my family is Mexican and I was raised in that culture, does not mean I have access to every single Mexican thing. I am not owed anything from any Mexican tradition. There are a ton of Mexican traditions. There is no one tradition. Like, I am not a curandera just because I'm Mexican. I have not been trained in curanderismo. I am not trained and I cannot operate any sort of healing work in that capacity. I do espiritismo, and that is my framework for a lot of things. I am not a bruja because I do not fulfill that community role. I have no real connection to any sort of specific Mexican witchcraft traditions. So I can't call myself a bruja in any capacity, or at least not in a capacity that I think is reasonable. I can call myself that in the same way that, I can call myself a witch because anyone can call themselves that, but, it's a lot more complicated, and we will circle back to that in another episode coming eventually. Again, just because I am of that culture does not mean that I have access to everything. And it's important to recognize that we are always going to be guests no matter where we go, no matter what tradition we're joining, until we are fully integrated into that tradition. Be a good guest. Be respectful of your elders. Be respectful of your peers. And be respectful of yourself and your spirits. So when we're talking about this, we have to ask, what are the appropriate authorities to go through? Are there any appropriate authorities to go through? Is there a priesthood? Are there mentors? Can you just kind of pick it up? It really depends. Some things do have a very strict priesthood. Some things are passed on mentor to mentee. Some things you have to join a family. You have to get married into a family and hope that you learn it. Some things are really just father to son, mother to daughter, grandma to granddaughter. And that's just kind of it. You're stuck with that. If you don't have that, then you can't easily access that. And that's kind of an unfortunate thing, but you learn to get over it and you move on. And sometimes people are lacking in granddaughters and they will pass it on to you. And you become adopted into that family in that way, which again goes back to our be a good guest situation. If there is formal initiation, then learn the steps for that, learn what you need to know and do for that, reach out to people, talk to them about it, and work to develop a rapport with a temple, a house, a line, whatever it might be called. And if you can just pick it up, then pick it up. Start doing the thing. Reach out to people who are doing the thing and say, hey, I'm doing the thing. Oh, I'm doing the thing too. Let's do the thing together. Let's trade ideas and understandings. Oh, I'm someone who was raised in the thing. Let me help you understand the thing better. Okay, awesome. Thank you. A lot of people are really nice. Like, you can kind of just talk to people. I mean, people reach out to me about stuff all the time, which I feel so self-conscious about sometimes because I'm like, I'm just a girl who just does like little stuff sometimes here and there. I'm not like anything super special, but I mean, I have a really good understanding and I'm good at talking to people, I guess, about stuff. So I do get reached out to a lot. If you ever reach out to me about a practice and want to know stuff, I will gladly talk with you about it. I just kind of ask that you respect any boundary I put. And I keep throwing around this word, integrate the practice, become the practice, be the practice, live it in your life. We have to understand what that means. How do we actually integrate? How do we fit it into the rest of our life? I'll just use kind of bog standard animism as a term here as an example. There's lots of animistic expressions throughout the world, especially expressions that deal with local plants, local stones, and the household. These are kind of the biggest things that people deal with almost everywhere. Not everyone has waterways, not everyone has mountains, but pretty much everyone's got like a couple plants and some rocks and a place of living. So who are the spirits of that? How do we understand them? Is all theoretical, but then there's the actual practical of, okay, well, I have a house spirit. I'm going to make a little space for the house spirit according to these measures and protocols. These are the taboos that I understand I have to follow, so I'm going to follow those. That's when we start adopting it. And then we start integrating when that becomes second nature. When we start saying, okay, my house spirit needs this. Okay, I'm going to do this now. Oh, I don't have a set protocol for this. Let me do a divination on it with these prescribed methods. Okay, now I understand how to do it because of these symbols that I recognize through this cultural lens, as well as my own foreknowledge and personal relationship with it. A lot of it is personal relationship. You know that you have to go out to the tree and you have to give it these specific offerings every single Saturday. So you go out to the tree, you give those offerings, and it starts out as just like a rote thing, like, okay, I have to do the thing. But then it becomes, okay, I do this thing and I start to develop an understanding. I spend time with the tree and I talk to the tree. And I tell the tree what I'm doing every day. And I'm like, tree, I'm doing this. Tree, I'm doing that. Oh, I'm planning on doing this thing, tree. Can you help me in this? Yes, I can help you in this. Perfect. Let's meet. Let's do the thing. And you adopt that into the practice. You can also just adopt small parts of a practice. Stuff that's like not bound in initiation and secrets. Like you can't go about just making like an inganga out of nowhere, but you can adopt smaller things, smaller ideas from different things. Folklore is especially great for this. Oh, in folk practices around the world, oak trees are associated with truth. Let me grind up some oak bark and put it in my truth spell. Boom, 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 boom. Easy money. I'm just out here saying things, guys. I don't even know what I'm talking about. I do. I do know what I'm talking about. But see how everything kind of fits in together, where the lines connect, where everything sort of starts to make sense, that middle line, that crossroads that we witches love to be at. The crossroads is enigmatic for a reason. It is where everything meets and everything departs and everything comes together and everything blows up. That made no sense, but I hope it did. When we're talking about folk, of course, we have to talk about the spirit folk. Who are the spirits of the practice? Who are the ancestors? What are they doing? Why are they doing? Who are they doing? Spirits have different protocols depending on traditions. What are those protocols? What are the taboos? What are the ways you approach some things? What are the things you really should not approach? What are the things that you approach with caution? Who are they and why do we perpetuate them? What are they doing? How are they doing it? How do we understand that they're doing it and how we make it easier for them to do the thing that they do so well? They usually hold a very deep cultural significance and take on specific roles that are tied back into the overall culture. Again, you don't have a fishing god if you don't fish. You don't have a volcano god if you don't have a volcano. So if you do have these things, why do you have these things? Why are they doing the things that they do? And we also have to not assume what the place in the cosmology is. Oftentimes, while it might be similar to a concept, it's not always the same thing as a concept. And we can't just one-to-one syncretize. We can't get all Victorian with it. We can't just say, oh, they do this thing in this one place that looks kind of like this thing in this other place. Therefore, they're all Mercury. It's the whole thing of is it the women of Willendorf or the Venus of Willendorf? What does Venus mean? What does woman mean? What does Willendorf mean? What does of mean? Everything is a question of why do we say the words that we say, because language is inherently poetic, but we try to act like it is fixed. Again, we're all acting, we're all pretending, we're all performing, being whatever we're trying to be. The ancestors are more straightforward, they're just the dead people who did the thing. I'm being very philosophical, but the ancestors are the guys who practice it, the people who made this stuff happen, the spirits of those ancestors who patroned them and who they talked to, the guy who was first initiated and made the stuff happen, whoever they are, that is an ancestor practice. These are all people who preserved it. They hold the keys to the tradition, and they not only can be venerated, but should be. You should venerate them. You should talk to them. You should say, I am trying to join Candomblé. Who are the ancestors of Candomblé? Well, they're these guys. Okay. I'm going to set up a small space for them. I'm going to honor them for what they did, how they brought this in, how they evolved it, how they changed it, how they ensured that this knowledge was preserved. Honor your ancestors, especially the ones you're trying to adopt. And with all of that, I have to also ask, how do you uplift this practice, especially if you are not part of the culture of origin? Share information and link back to solid sources. Share open information, make people more aware, especially dispelling misinformation, and bringing about more understanding for it while uplifting the voices of the people who are especially born into the tradition. If you can find people born into it, that would be phenomenal. champion the people who the tradition belongs to. Which I also did say that it doesn't belong to anyone, but you know what I mean. Many traditions of folk magic are born out of oppression, and they still struggle with that to this day. It is people magic. It is the magic of people, and people tend to be oppressed. They will not tell you this. Like, they literally won't tell you this, like, at all, actually. People still suffer all kinds of oppression to this day, and we just try to normalize it and make it as small as possible and turn any victory into the final victory. Anyways, bottom text. You should always be seeing why stuff is done. You should really question, why are we doing this thing? I mean, the most easiest example of folk magic representing oppression is saint syncretization. Quite literally, we were colonized. We have to use these saints now. That's kind of the long and short of it, XD. Understanding your place in that oppression as well is important. You know, centering and refocusing voices back onto the people who are oppressed. If you yourself do not face the oppression for being part of the tradition, you should do work to ensure the tradition goes on and ensure that the people who the tradition culturally originates from are safe and protected so that they can continue the tradition of their people with you as their guest. And ultimately, you should find communities and teachers if you want to take on a full practice or a tradition. Like, you really, really should seek out community. And I know it's super hard. I know it is super hard. But it is super doable. It is a thing that you can do. It is a thing that is possible. I have done it in my life. I am still seeking out community. I'm still growing in community, and while I do tend to emphasize in-person community, online community is real. Online community is valid. Should not be the be-all end-all, and neither should in-person community, but in-person community is something I champion more specifically. But, you know, find people who do the thing and join the community of people doing the stuff. By the very nature, folk magic is created by its folk. Therefore, it is a living tradition because people are alive. We have to ensure that we always center it as a living, breathing organism and not a snapshot in time. We cannot pretend like our folk magic is an idyllic 1920s, 1860s, 1790s, 1412. As much as I really want to be the night flying witch who terrorizes the town in the 1500s, it's not the 1500s, girl. Capitalism is horrible. Industrial revolution and its consequences. Have to deal with that. We make new adaptations. We make new changes. We make sure that we live and we move forward. And yes, it is stressful to find mentors. Especially legitimate ones. Especially ones who actually know what the fuck they're talking about and aren't stealing your money. And there's a lot of fucking fighting in community, and it's really irritating. I have to be so honest. I really do hate how much, especially the Afro-Latin communities, fight. I mean, kind of one of the first things I ever got introduced with was people talking about how houses in Venezuela are not valid for Ifa or Ocha in any capacity. And I was just like, okay, sure, whatever. People will fight about literally everything. People will say one person is valid, one person is not. They will say, oh, my house does it differently, therefore it is wrong. Houses are different. Everyone's different. Everyone does a bunch of different things. There's different lines. There's different understandings. And if you go back all the way to the beginning of these traditions, they don't look the same. And that's okay. Because if it wasn't okay, the spirits wouldn't come down, the spirits wouldn't do stuff, nothing would happen. It's okay, honey. You can do the thing, even if your online op doesn't do the thing the same way. As long as you're both doing the thing. As long as the spirits are all saying you're doing the thing. If it works, it works. With all that said, here's a simple working to be able to find a mentor and initiate into a tradition. Light a white candle in front of an image of an ancestor of the tradition you're trying to enter into, and give them appropriate offerings. Speak to their spirit about what you're looking for in a mentor and why you wish to join the practice. I recommend also making a petition paper and offering that in front of them. Do this once a week on a relevant day until the mentor enters your life. Really simple, really easy. If you don't have a specific ancestor you want to go to a open spirit of the tradition. If you're trying to get into, let's say, a specific form of Greek witchcraft, petition Hecate, right? If you're trying to learn more specific Mexica reconstruction traditions, petition Quetzalcoatl, or petition Nanahuatzin, petition Coatlicue, or petition Our Lady of Guadalupe, you know? These spirits are very much ready to help out, or at least they're ready to help out me. I can't say they will always help out everyone, but petition the spirits that are close to you and that you're able to sort of get closer towards in their orbits. And ask, hi, I can't do the thing right now, but I want to do the thing. If you want me to do the thing, help me do the thing. Bring me the mentor that lets me do the thing. Especially if you have dreams about it, petition them saying, I have this dream about you. I have this dream about you wanting me to do this thing. I want to do the thing. Bring me the person who lets me do the thing. Don't lose hope in all this. That's the biggest thing. I took a while to get a lot of these results. I took a while to start getting the community around Hecate that I have been slowly developing and cultivating. I'm very grateful, and it's kind of good that it didn't happen instantly. I have to be so honest, because y'all, I just graduated college a year ago. I don't know what the fuck I'm doing with my life, as much as I act like I do. Again, we're all performing, we're all pretending to be the thing. But by joining community, you learn so much more than just a mentor. We all learn together. We're all sharing ideas. We're all getting new stuff. And we're like, oh, I did this thing and this happened. Have you tried doing this thing with your stuff? No, I haven't. Let's try it together. Which online community is really good at doing. In-person community is great as well. Obviously, it's what I, again, center and focus, but if you just have online community, start a Discord server, start a group chat, and say, okay, we're going to try doing these things, we're going to try doing this stuff. Which segues very nicely into new folk magics, because, again, folk magic is alive and beating. It is a heart that keeps pounding because people keep living. It's not bound to the distant past, but today we are creating new lore, new traditions, and ways of doing things. New understandings develop as cities grow, as urbanization happens, the spirits change. We have spirits of cities, we have spirits of sidewalks, we have spirits of crossroads that are now paved roads and aren't dirt roads where the devil meets you with his horses because he has a car now. I've actually not seen Devil with a car, but I'm sure that's a thing out there, Car lore is a whole thing. Roadside spirits, roadside devils, ghosts who hitchhike, all this kind of stuff. That's folk magic. We are our own folk. We need to not romanticize the idyllic witch living in the village on the edge of the forest. As much as I am that and want to be that, simultaneously, we have to recognize that we are what we bring to community, and we are what forms it, what gives it life. We are the limbs, we are the eyes, we are the things that move in the world, that bring this community together, that bring life to these practices, that allow them to become what they are today. When we uplift community, we uplift ourselves. Creating new rites and new lore is very important. Again, especially as value centers change, as needs change, as wants change, as the ability to do things change. We have less access to farm animals because most of us aren't farmers, but we have hella access to all kinds of books and literary material. We have hella access to jewelry. We have all these different things that were previously not super easy to get. Animals now are harder to get, so it changes things quite a bit. And nothing should ever be fixed in place. Nothing is ever going to be fixed in place. The worship of ashes of a fire prevents us from stoking the ever-growing fire of tradition and knowledge. By feeding the fire that is knowledge, wisdom, community, strength, and the ability to grow into something new, we are feeding ourselves. We are feeding not just ourselves, but our ancestors and our descendants. We are creating lineage. Why would we worship the ashes of the fire when we are the fire itself? The balance of uncovering and co-creating new methods, lore and tradition, while also preserving the core of tradition is the beating heart of what folk magic is. We are always operating in a world where we create new things with our spirits, with our communities, through dreams, through trial and error, through, hey, I think this is a good idea. My cards say it's a good idea. Let's do it. Oh, it's a great idea. Here, you should try this. Here, you should try that. The DKMU is a great example of this. This is a crazy hot take. The DKMU is folk magic. I'm not elaborating. That's fucking it. But, it is sharing and creating new lore and experiences that coincide and align with understandings of the world, because folk magic is a retention of knowledge. Oral lore is more than just a cool spell you can do. It's more than do this spell and this thing will happen, but it's a fundamental understanding about the world. We see all throughout the world folk spirits, different types of workings and ways of doing things are in reaction to the world around them. Lost Day Away work doesn't just exist because, nowadays we're all ACAB and fuck cops, which is based, by the way. Don't fuck a cop, though. We don't fuck cops in this house, but fuck cops. Lost Day Away work originates with killing slave masters so you could get the fuck off a plantation and be a free person. That's where it originates from. And we have to recognize that. We have to be able to see that Lost Day Away work in the modern incarnation that it comes down to us, specifically because it is an inheritance of hoodoo in popularized American folk magic, which is a complex term that has a lot of nuance to it. We have to understand that this comes from oppression. This comes from a need to do something. And the way that it was done historically and the way it is done now are fundamentally different because our needs have changed, our ability to do things have changed. A big part of shoe culture has to do with the laying of powders that kill people. This is a super fascinating aspect of folk magic and the way it affects culture. The word goofy comes from using goofer dust to kill slave masters. It's kind of insane how much of our culture is impacted by folk magic. But I digress. I'm getting very heated. I'm trying to be cooling myself now. But to fundamentally understand that this lore is passed on to understand the world. It is called Old Wives' Tales, and part of that is a big sexism thing. Part of that is that when we deride knowledge as illegitimate because it's not written down in a book and validated by a system, we lose that knowledge. And that loss of knowledge only benefits people who want to keep oppressing the people of folk magic. When we understand that this is practices and rites born out of necessity, both the necessity of I have to protect myself in the material world, and also the necessity of I need to have a spiritual connection to something deeper, stronger, and beyond whatever this fucked up capitalist hellscape, whatever this fucked up industrial revolution, whatever this fucked up feudal system has to offer me. That is folk magic. The people doing what they must to overcome what is unjust. So create and share responsibly. My final message. I said a lot in this episode. I really hope that some of it made sense. I really hope that most of it made sense. I really hope that we all learned something today. I'm hoping it wasn't too controversial, but just controversial enough that people are like, oh, she ate with that. I don't have much of a conclusion here other than, again, create and share responsibly. Learn from each other and allow yourself to grow beyond what you thought was possible, what you thought you were, who you thought you were, and what you thought others were. So to round this all out, our folk festival songs, which is a little music segment for this episode, are Winter's Going by Bonnie Dobson and Sanctuary Stone by Midwinter. These are folk style songs that I really like. That's kind of the lore behind them. Nothing super special. I just really love them, and they help me feel more connected to the world around me. And I think that's very important to life in general. So, thank you all for watching. I will see you all very soon. So mote it be.